You. So,
Welcome to
so a
Equity
few,
Capital Conversations. This is your host, Benjamin Sklar, and today's guest is Donna Ackerly and Keith Haynes, the CEO and COO of Lioness Consulting, a corporate governance advisory firm focused on helping companies manage shareholder transactions, orchestrating annual and special meetings, proxy contests, mergers and acquisitions. I'm so excited to have Keith and Donna on the show today because I see them as titans, OG legends in the industry, people who've been doing for decades proxy solicitations and working with CEOs, CFOs, and helping them grow their companies. So thank you so much, Donna and Keith, for hopping on the show, and let's kick it off. So
great.
Sure.
Thank you, Benji.
first off, Donna, tell us, how did you get started in this industry?
So, a few years after graduating from college and working in various administrative roles, I began working for the pioneer firm in the proxy solicitation industry and have remained in the field since. And it is some years ago, I admit, but it's also at a time when retail shareholders were the primary investors in publicly traded companies. Corporate governance was just beginning to evolve as Institutional Shareholder Services, now known as ISS, was co-founded by Bob Monks and Nell Minow, and that gave rise to the hostile takeovers, which prompted a focus on the board and accountability to shareholders. Over the course of my career, I worked on numerous M&A, mergers and acquisition transactions, proxy contests, and thousands of shareholder meetings.
I believe you. All right, Keith, if CEOs listening to this podcast right now, they're busy, they want to get knowledge quickly and value. So if you're speaking to a room full of CEOs, what's your message?
Preparation, Benji. As you said, CEOs want to focus on running their businesses, right? So what we endeavor to do is to give them as much early preparation into this required process, right? Every publicly traded company has to have some sort of shareholder meeting each year, usually an annual meeting. Those meetings involve a number of agenda items, from sort of relatively innocuous items like the ratification of auditors, to more complex issues involving the board of directors, compensation, various other items, right? So our goal is to be at the table with not only the CEO, but sometimes the CFO, corporate secretary, director of investor relations, and doing some active listening and discovery so that they can prepare appropriately for these upcoming events. Usually that involves a bit of peeling the onion, I like to refer to it. Sort of getting a sense of what their previous shareholder meeting experience was. Maybe it was the year before, whether it went well, what went well, what didn't. Did a vote on a particular proposal fail or receive significant opposition? So we start with sort of a deeper dive into sort of the whys and wheres of what occurred at previous meetings.
And the CEOs who are looking for your services, at what stage is the company typically?
All stages. So it can be, a company that has just gone public and is preparing for its very first annual meeting. Or it can be, a company that is much further along in its life cycle and has had, decades of annual meetings. The point being, every company at some point in its life cycle, in all likelihood, is going to need proxy and corporate governance advice.
Right. Donna, what are some major trends you see shaping the proxy solicitation industry over the next 5 years?
Corporate governance will continue to evolve. When the concept was first developed, I guess back in the 1970s, it really wasn't taking full shape at that point. Boards of directors were just full of, I guess, more the cronies and friends of the CEO and chairman. But nowadays, it's really focused on diversity in the boardroom. It's focused on having enough women on the board to really balance out the power on the board. It's independence and other things that are really important to shareholders today.
Right.
Keith, anything else there?
Yeah, you hit it on the head. It's primarily corporate governance, right? Which, covers a myriad of issues, as we all know. That can speak to, as Donna just mentioned, board composition, really independence and diversity. That's much more of an issue these days than it was decades ago. Donna mentioned, gender diversity. There's also, in some instances, a focus on racial diversity. So there's board composition. Then there's individual director nominee attributes, right? There's much more of a focus year to year on whether directors deserve to be reelected. It's no longer a rubber stamp. So you can look at some of the basics, like did Director John Smith attend at least 75% of his board meetings? If not, there needs to be a valid excuse. But then there are other issues, such as directors not being overextended, what's referred to as overboarding, right? So, directors that typically are serving on more than 5 public company boards, or are CEOs of public companies who serve on the boards of more than 2 additional public companies besides their own, will probably get some pushback from shareholders. And there are many more issues I'll go into a little bit as we progress through this call, but those are some of the sort of high-level items that are getting more focus these days.
Good to know. My law firm, SRFC, has over 100 publicly traded company clients. If you were speaking to them, what are some best practices for the CEOs on how to better manage their communications with their shareholders?
That is the question. We have, for a number of years now, so it's not necessarily new advice, but it bears sort of hammering home on a regular basis, because we find that a lot of clients sort of lose sight of the fact that they need to continually keep in touch with their shareholder bases. As you know, Benji and Donna, shareholder bases evolve. Investors come in and out of stocks. Speaking to particularly larger institutional investors who tend to hold more sway over voting issues and impact on at a very high level how the vote ultimately results. It's important to have an investor relations or robust communications program, at least to the top shareholders of the company, and not just on the portfolio manager side, but identifying who that company and its representatives can speak with on the voting side. And sometimes there can be a disconnect, but you always want to be able to reliably and accurately reach out to key people within institutional investors and other key shareholders, throughout the year.
Last week, I went to an event, and Daniel Loeb, the founder of the hedge fund Third Point Management, a famous activist investor, was there. And I was asking him questions about shareholder activism. What role does a proxy solicitation firm play in shareholder activism?
Sure. It can be a big role. As you mentioned, Mr. Loeb, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of activists out there who wage campaigns, put pressure on, various boards, do a lot of behind the scenes communication with boards of companies on a regular basis. As a proxy solicitor and corporate governance advisor, we initially try to gather as much background information on said activists as possible, so that, think of it as kind of a dossier, right? So that the CEO, the board, senior executives have as much information about the tendencies of a Mr. Loeb going into a potential situation if they have in fact been contacted. The other key thing, Benji, is to take a snapshot of the overall shareholder base, right? Think of it as kind of as proxy solicitors being sort of campaign managers, right? Akin to what a campaign manager would do during a political campaign. You want to look at various segments and pockets of potential support and opposition, try to measure what type of messaging is best suited to positively influencing your outreach to those holders, and more importantly, helping said CEO and board anticipate what some of the possible outcomes might be. So we often run a variety of scenarios for companies. Once we've taken that snapshot I mentioned of the shareholder base to see who the key institutions are, how much is held in retail, whether or not there are other influential shareholders out there. And you kind of create a ledger, right, of who the company has good communication and relationships with, other entities that they might not be as close to or not know as much about. Part of our job is to give them as much information about not only the activists, but the institutional investors, the retail base, other key shareholders as possible, and sort of game plan it, right? So that if we get into sort of a proactive activist situation, we have something that can be executed and instituted from day one.
Donna, most of my listeners are arguably young professionals, people in their early 20s and 30s. If you were speaking to a room full of young professionals right now, what's some advice you would have for them on how to enter the proxy solicitation industry and why they should in the first place?
So working in the proxy solicitation industry is just absolutely fascinating. There's just something new and the unknown every day. And I always like to advise young folks that get into the field by working in an operational role so that they have a complete understanding of how the process works. It's not a matter of just picking up a telephone and making a call to a shareholder, but it's really understanding the fundamentals of the shareholder composition, as Keith referred to, and then what we also do are these vote projection analyses to determine the likelihood of success. That understanding will pave the way for a thoroughly enjoyable and fun career in the proxy solicitation industry.
I would also add to that, Benji and Donna, it's become much more of an academic exercise as well over the decades. So I would encourage those same young people either thinking of entering into the industry, whether it's working for a proxy solicitor or working within a law firm, within a corporate advisory practice or an investment bank. These days, just about all categories of advisors have people who, form a subset of specialists that, focus on proxy solicitations and activism. And the things, there's a ton of information out there that you don't necessarily learn in college, right? I'm not sure even to today, there may be some programs within, MBA programs now, but, usually it's up to you to learn it once you get out there. From studying the in-depth policies of an institutional shareholder services (ISS) or Glass Lewis, or going online and looking at some of the larger institutional investors and studying how they view their position voting wise on a variety of topics. So it's almost an endless subject. ESG is sort of the moniker, right? Environmental, social, governance. That covers a lot. Sustainability. So, within that, said student can also become sort of a specialist, within Proxy on, various types of, issues of study.
Right. All right, Keith, what strategies do you recommend for companies facing hostile takeovers or significant shareholder dissent?
So it speaks back to knowing who your shareholders are. One, significant prep and study and sort of dossier preparation on the entity or person who is making a hostile overture. Usually the issue revolves around increasing or maximizing shareholder value, right? So companies that tend to be targets of hostile activist overtures or takeovers are ones that, rightly or wrongly, are perceived as underperforming, right? So the best way to prepare is to not get yourself in that situation to begin with, right? By, having positive total shareholder returns versus your peers, having a good, robust shareholder communications program, but then also, giving, fair time to listening to the grievances of shareholders. Shareholders, just like anyone, sort of push back when they feel they're being ignored. So you want to be able to demonstrate that your board over time has been responsive to various shareholder issues. And that doesn't necessarily mean, an activist threatening to wage a proxy fight, but it could be over, compensation issues or, items that have been, from a corporate governance standpoint, put into your bylaws, right? You don't, as a corporate entity, want to appear like you're not hearing people. It's no longer an excuse to say, well, we're busy running our business. Once shareholders have a sense that this is sort of a secondary issue, that's when they tend to take advantage and pounce. Now, look, there are, we could do a whole separate section on, proxy fights and takeover situations. It's extremely complex. It usually involves a variety of advisors within the working group, right? So, lawyers in the boardroom, investment bankers, public relations firms that specialize in activist and contested and takeover situations. Obviously proxy solicitors. So there can be, at sort of the highest level, and Donna and I have been involved in these situations over the decades where, coordinating, the right advisors for the situation is important in helping you prepare, respond, and execute if need be, should the situation go to sort of the next level. The other thing is, a lot of potential activists in hostile situations these days, end up in some sort of settlement. So just because there's an overture doesn't mean that, it has to go to sort of, DEFCON 5, right? There needs to be an open line of communication, whether that's, between company representatives and, the party that's threatening the overture, the legal team, the investment bankers. So there's a lot that happens behind the scenes that I think people aren't even aware of. You kind of read the big headline, Walt Disney proxy fight, something like that, right? But ultimately, entities would rather try to avoid the expense, right, of a hostile situation. It takes time away from running the business. It costs a lot of money. So I would say the first step is to see whether there can be some sort of resolution before the gloves come completely off. Now, there's a lot more to this. As I said, we could spend hours, but I think in a nutshell, that those are some of the key points.
Can you discuss a time when you had to manage a proxy fight or shareholder dispute during a crisis?
Oh, sure, sure. I remember, years ago, when both Donna and I were with Georgeson, we represented Target stores against William Ackman, the very well known hedge fund manager, and that's one of those instances where each side had a whole army of advisors. There was not only us as a proxy solicitor, but we partnered with other proxy solicitors. There were multiple investment bankers, multiple legal advisors, right? And while we ultimately won the proxy fight, it was ultimately over board seats, but involved spin-offs of some of Target's real estate and a variety of other issues. But the work itself was fascinating. We did quite a bit of road shows. I can recall specifically us sort of splitting up into groups and mapping out who would fly where around the country to meet with various institutional investors. So I was paired with the CFO at that time of Target, and I believe the corporate secretary. Others had other groups, and we in a day would sometimes fly to 3 or 4 cities, and have meetings with portfolio managers and voting committees. All I'm gonna sort of revert back to that campaign management style of execution, right? What are Kamala Harris and Donald Trump doing now? They're going around the country campaigning and meeting with various categories of constituents, right? That's a lot of what's involved when you get to a full blown proxy fight. So yeah.
What differentiates a good proxy solicitor from the best?
I think, and Donna can chime in on this too, those that have a wealth of historical and legacy knowledge of key shareholders and situations. So, it's important that there's sort of this legacy knowledge of the history of the business, right? And situations that have occurred over not just the past couple of years, but sometimes over decades, so that you can mine that memory, right? And the knowledge that was gleaned from, oh yeah, we were in this situation. I remember Gillette Shamrock Holdings way back in the day, or I remember Target Ackman. Various situations that you can almost case study, right? So that you can bring sort of some relevant commonality from certain situations as you're advising the board on whatever it is, the current situation they're facing. So that's important. But then also, being able to manage expectations, right? Both from sort of a vote outcome perspective and just knowing what the process is going to be like. A lot of companies aren't used to going through full-blown proxy fights and activist situations. So in many ways, even though they are, seasoned and experienced executives and the best at what they do within their companies and their industries, they need to be coached, effectively on how to do this, right? So the best solicitors are the ones who, are able to convey those teachings, right? Take that CEO by the hand, take that director of investor relations by the hand, and lend that legacy knowledge that I mentioned earlier to the situation at hand.
That was very well said. I learned a lot from that snippet right there. Seriously. So looking ahead, what do you think are the key challenges and opportunities for proxy solicitation firms over the years?
You want to start that out, Donna?
Sure. It's a practice that will continue to evolve and change over time. I always think back to years ago when I think I mentioned at the outset that retail shareholders were the largest population of investors in publicly traded companies. But nowadays, more companies have largely held by institutional investors. But with that said, there are still those companies that have a large retail shareholder following, and getting the vote from those shareholders will continue to be a challenge, very similar to a political election.
How do you balance the interests of institutional investors with retail investors in a proxy contest?
So in many ways, the sort of the highest level messaging is the same. If you recall, Benji, I mentioned, many situations are about shareholder returns, right? You don't have to be a BlackRock, to want the value of your investment, to increase measurably over a period of time, right? I would say on the institutional side, they're and depending on the institution, because some of them are many of them are public entities or retirement systems and pension funds. So their interests and obligations on behalf of the investors that they represent, whether it's a teacher's fund out of a certain state or municipality, I think is much more varied than it might be for your average retail investor like you, me, and Donna, right? So the messaging, I think, is and this isn't to diminish the value or certainly not the knowledge of retail investors, because many of them, particularly these days, since they have access to much more information than they used to back in the day, they are quite savvy as well and much more informed, I think, now than decades ago. But there is this emphasis on knowing what the priorities of top institutionals are going to be before they make a final decision on whether or not they're going to vote for your company's or management's nominees or proposals versus how retail investors are going to vote. As Donna mentioned, a lot of times, most institutions are going to vote, right? So the participation percentage for institutional investors is always very, very high, right? That's not the case with retail investors, right? I can recall in some proxy fights, we would actually schedule town halls for retail investors. Again, akin to what our presidential candidates are probably doing right now, getting their campaign manager to, schedule, a town hall or, a rally in Milwaukee, and then Santa Fe, and then Pennsylvania, what have you. At its most robust, and particularly with large cap companies that have still a majority of institutional ownership, but a lot of retail shares out there as well. It can behoove them to almost make a sort of separate parallel effort and communication effort to the retail base. And that's where, pardon me, that's where solicitors can come in handy too, because they can break down geographically for you as a company sort of where the concentrations are of shares.
Got it. All good. All right, Donna, how is technology transforming the proxy solicitation process? Are there any innovative tools or platforms that you believe are game changers?
Oh, yes, there are some. And I'm drawing a blank on the one right now, but there's a platform out there where there's a lot of shareholders that exchange comments and feedback about a particular company. And sometimes it does get pretty ugly. And I had one client some years ago that actually was able to befriend an investor to sway them onto over to their side to then leverage that to communicate with other investors about why they should vote for a particular situation. So, yeah, there are times that things could be a bit more challenging than they were years ago, because prior to the day of the internet and other forms of electronic communication, shareholders just really relied on paper voting by mail, and that was it.
What challenges do you face in ensuring the security and integrity of proxy voting in this ever increasing digital world?
Well, today, more things are done electronically. So the vast majority of proxies are voted instead of directly with the brokerage firms through a firm known as Broadridge Financial Solutions, and also Beta Next Media Communications. Those two firms have the vast majority of the brokerage firms, handle the proxy mailings for the vast majority of the brokerage firms on the street. So everything is done either directly with those firms by mail, by telephone, or really largely by the internet these days. And they will they have the capacity to really track the methods of voting that are done and actually aggregate the voting results and then issue a master proxy for those shares. So it's done without with absolute integrity on their part.
I would add, Benji, that if it goes to contested solicitations, proxy fights, the process is somewhat different. You still have what Donna mentioned, Broadridge, sort of issuing a proxy on behalf of all of the street name holders that has already been vetted and verified and secured. But usually at the end of a proxy fight, remember, you're going to have two sides, right? So again, like a political campaign, one side's going to submit its ballots, the other side's going to submit its ballots, which all end up in the hands of an independent inspector of election, who essentially recounts the votes, right? To make sure that, what we think our vote count is versus what the opposition thinks their vote count is accurate, right? So it's you go into the contested shareholder meeting estimating that, okay, we've won, or we've won these number of seats on our board, and perhaps the opposition has won one, but none of that becomes conclusive until the vote is actually certified by an independent inspector of election. And sometimes that can mean, issuing preliminary vote results from the independent inspector, and then both sides getting in a room together, right? And then doing sort of a third review of the physical proxies that were given to the independent inspector to see whether or not they actually counted the vote in an accurate fashion, right? So that process can take a week, sometimes more, depending on the size of the contested campaign, and then ultimately results in the inspector releasing certified results publicly to sort of finish things off.
That was very educational. I did not know a lot of that. So thank you for breaking it down.
Sure.
Before we go, what are your last words? What's the message you'd like to get out there? Each of you.
Sure. So for me, I would say, although we are a relatively new physical entity, Lioness Consulting LLC, we are an experienced advisory. Between as you mentioned earlier, and Donna's reiterated, we started out very young in this business, a while back. So, I think, companies that are looking for almost a bespoke experience, sort of a close, targeted, very personal effort from a proxy solicitor. That's what you might get, not might, but that's what you will get from Lioness Consulting LLC. Our focus, quite honestly, right now is on advising relatively small to mid-cap companies, as well as companies that have gone newly public. We want to teach boards and companies best practices from the get-go, right? And those that even might be midstream right now, if they're doing things that haven't necessarily served them well, we're here to sort of maybe provide some corrective advice, right? To help companies sort of get back on the right track when it comes to all issues related to, shareholder communications, annual meetings, special meetings, etc.
Very informative. Donna?
So, in addition to corporate proxy work, which Keith has mentioned, Linus Consulting LLC also specializes in handling extension votes for special purpose acquisition companies and their de-SPAC transactions. We also serve as information agent for tender offers and exchange offers. And the role of an information agent really is to convey information that the company publishes to their shareholders to rally their support for a particular corporate action, whether it's a tender offer for a buyback of their own shares or an exchange offer of usually one debt instrument for another. That's pretty much everything that we do. So thank you very much, Benji.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Keith. Really appreciate you hopping on the show today. And I look forward to meeting you in person soon.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for having us. Take care.